my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, I know I said at the last episode that we were going to be back on regular scheduled programming. However, life was not agreeing with me there. If you guys tuned into the last episode, you know that I recently made a big move. I moved from Seattle all the way down to San Antonio. So if you've ever made a big move like that, you know it can be stressful, and there's a lot more that goes into it than I imagined. So I was able to carve out some time and come back and say hello and bring you guys another episode. So thank you so much for your patience, and let's get into it. One thing I've noticed a lot about myself lately is that I am relying a lot more on caffeine than I ever have, even during my earlier years of college. Like, for example, I am up at 5 a.m. every day for the gym, and I cannot get through a workout without my pre-workout. Code Leslie96 for all your bucked up essentials, by the way. And then for work, while I'm headed for work, I need to stop by the coffee stand for my 16-ounce iced sugar-free vanilla oat milk latte. And then around 2 o'clock, I'm reaching for my mid-afternoon Celsius. At this point, it's a raging caffeine addiction, I'm telling you. Do I care? I should. I really should. Do I? Like I said, I should, but you know what? Life is too short, and I'm just praying that I'll eventually figure it out. Well, speaking of caffeine, as I was re-evaluating all of my life choices, as one does, I remember this study that I once stumbled upon a few years ago about the effects of caffeine compared to other drugs on spiders, and something to do about how they spun their web. Does that ring a bell for anyone? I know I've mentioned it to some people, and some people go, yeah, I do remember. I don't know where I heard it, but I do remember it. And others, it's like, no, I have no idea what the F you're talking about. And they look at me like I'm crazy. I am, but and being the curious cat that I am, I looked into it and I realized that I was in fact not crazy, because it's a real study that did in fact happen, and it was conducted by none other than NASA. So if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Okay, so our friend today is Dr. Peter N. Witt. Peter, Mr. Witt, Dr. Witt, however you want to call him, he's quite the interesting guy, okay? The first thing that pops up when you Google his name is his website, drpeterwitt.com. His website is full of information on all of his research, his studies, his experiments, and even a short little biography if by the end of the episode you'd like to check it out, which is very interesting, I'm telling you. I highly suggest you do check it out. First thing you notice when you begin to read up on his research is that there is one common denominator there, and that is that he is quite the heightened interest for spiders. I'm telling you, I've never seen anything like it. They were at the center of practically all his studies, despite being a medical researcher for most of his life. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So anyways, in 1948, Dr. Peter was approached by a colleague with a small complaint. You see, this colleague of his was a zoologist who was filming spiders and their web spinning for a documentary on spiders and their web spinning. He and the other scientists would stay up late in the night wanting to catch them in the act, but they would soon fall asleep because, it's natural to get a little sleepy, right? Then they would wake up and see that the spiders had already spun their webs and they completely slept through the whole thing. And remember, this was 1948, way before any sophisticated filming equipment that could be kept running without human assistance even existed. So the colleague was wondering if Dr. Peter could help him out in figuring out a way to get spiders to shift their web building schedule to something a little later that would accommodate to the scientist's sleeping schedule. The zoologists, they wouldn't have to sacrifice their sleeping schedule, and that's what they wanted. Okay. Honestly, part of me is I get it, but also, this is your job. I'm sure you guys could figure out a way to stay up all night at least once, like maybe sleep through the day for like a week or something. Does that make sense? But that's just me. So, anyways, being the good friend that he is, Dr. Peter was like, for sure, I can totally help you out. So, he devised an experiment where he would get the spiders high from different types of drugs and measure the shift, if any, in their web spinning schedule. Being the pharmacologist that he is, Dr. Peter had access to a number of psychedelic drugs, including marijuana and mescaline, that he was more than happy to donate to his colleagues for science. In the end, the zoologists were disappointed because there was no effect on the spider's web spinning schedule, like at all. Drugs had no effect on it. And that was it for them. That was it for the zoologists. That's all they needed, really. For Dr. Peter, however, this was just the beginning. Because although there was no effect on the spider's spinning schedule, there was an overall effect on the spider's web spinning. Interestingly enough, there was a significant change in the spider's webs, just not in the schedule of the webs. The webs created by the spiders receiving the different drugs looked rather different from each other than from the spiders who were sober. That's quite a sentence I'd never thought I'd ever say out loud. In the end, this heightened Dr. Peter's interest, and some say that this specific experiment is what piqued his interest in spiders because remember, he's a pharmacologist. His work is dedicated to humans and human behavior, to the point that almost immediately after the drug spiders experiment, Dr. Peter transferred his research from humans to spiders. He was so fascinated by how much he was able to interpret the spider's behaviors from the effects of the drugs in comparison to human behavior. He knew that the human nervous system was extremely complex, but also variable between individuals, let alone human behavior, which just made it all the more difficult to interpret the effects of different drugs on said behavior. For example, for his research on human behavior, he noted that under some influences, humans would experience fantastic dreams, others a wide range of powerful emotions from the same drug and no other added variables. Spiders, on the other hand, were much simpler organisms. Okay, now don't come for me for what I'm about to say, okay? Because you guys know that I am not a STEM girly. Okay, I am a psychology, criminal justice, social science girly, okay? But it does kind of sound like Dr. Peter was like, humans are a little too hard. Spiders are a lot more easy to work with. I'm gonna go with spiders. Okay, like I said, don't come for me. That's just what it sounds like. Okay, so Dr. Peter hypothesized that if the effects of different drugs translated to consistent, clearly observable change in behavior, in this case the appearance of the spun spider web, then spiders could provide an important insight into what made each drug different. He took it a step further and believed that the spiders may even be useful for identifying small quantities of unknown drugs, such as in cases of poisoning. Honestly, I find his thinking very interesting because there is virtually no similarity between spiders and humans, at least not back in 1948, that modern scientists of those days knew about. Like, when it comes to our nervous system and our body systems, there was no parallels, there was no connections, like I said, at least back then. So Dr. Peter, he was thinking way outside the box here. Kudos to him. We may carry some similarities in a few proteins that make up our muscles and certain body parts, but as far as the chemicals that cause us to react, there are none. So, being the scientist that he is, I guess I would have expected him to know that. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a STEM girly. So, someone who is, please explain to me in the comments how it was that he came to this connection. Please and thank you. Anyways, Dr. Peter continued this little experiment on his own. The other zoologists got, or rather didn't, what they needed from Dr. Peter, so he was now on his own, which was totally fine for him because if anything, it meant more creative freedom. Dr. Peter began to test the spider webs under the influence of other drugs. These drugs included amphetamine, mescaline, marijuana, benzodrine, LSD, and even antidepressants. He did this by lacing sugar water with the experimental drugs and using a small pipette to place a droplet on the spider's mouth. Through his studies, he was able to find that different drugs did, in fact, affect the spiders differently, a lot more than he had discovered in his initial study that he did for the zoologist. For example, the stimulant benzodrine caused spiders to zigzag unsteadily while building the spiral web of the spiral part of the web, making it a little bit uneven. The stone spiders, as in marijuana, on the other hand, were able to spiral just fine, but would admit to the first part of the spiral, only ever completing the center part of the web. So they kind of got a little lazy, or they kind of got out of focus towards the end. Then there were the spiders on depressants who apparently just forgot to finish the web. I'm laughing because it all just sounds so silly. Like, do you guys hear what I'm saying? Like, it just sounds silly, but this is science. This is a hard science. It's experimental science. And I guess I get what he's getting at, but like I said, it just sounds silly. But anyways, in the mid 1950s, Dr. Peter was feeding spiders flies that had been loaded with LSD, creating the first known arachnid acid trip. Arachnid. English isn't my first language, so excuse the mispronunciation of many words. According to his findings, these spiders seemed completely unaware of outside influences, concentrated on the job, and produced more perfect webs than when in a normal state, aka sober. Really? Like LSD? Like, because it sure sounds a lot more like Adderall. Not that I would know, I'm just putting that out there. The whole thing is just silly. Like, this is what y'all's grandparents' tax dollars were paying for, and I can't help but chuckle just a little bit because, again, the parallels between spiders and human behavior is very minute. And Dr. Peter knew this, like, he's a smart man. Now, the relevance of his results were always uncertain from the very beginning, honestly, mostly because he was unable to, like, actually interview the spiders. So he couldn't be sure how the effects of the drugs related to the human experience and just presumed that he would never know. Ultimately, his results showed that no firm conclusions were drawn about human relevance. For example, although the experiments showed increased focus and productivity when the spiders were high on LSD, any medical professional would highly advise you to just stay away from LSD in general, just as a whole. You get what I'm saying? So fast forward 40 years. Dr. Peter's interest in spiders and their response to various drugs continued through his whole life and his whole career. For what exact reason, I don't think we'll ever really know. But it wasn't until the 1990s that a big name in the science community took an interest in Dr. Peter's research and decided to put their own twist on it. In 1995, NASA scientists published their own study in which marijuana, benzodrine, chloral hydrate, and caffeine were involved. Now, this is NASA, as in the National Aeronautics and Space Administrations. What drugged up spiders had to do with spaceflight is uncertain. NASA themselves doesn't go into detail about exactly how, if at all, the experiment related to spaceflight. So see, now I'm curious, because what are they trying to hide? There has to be a reason that they don't want the public to know about and therefore are just passing it along as a quirky little fun experiment. But nonetheless, unlike previous studies like the ones by Dr. Peter, NASA was able to apply modern computing and statistical methods to their experiments. They digitized the web structures and found that the structure of the web correlated with the toxicity of the substance being tested. In other words, the more toxic the substance, the more deformed the web looks compared to a sober spider's web. Benzodrine led to the creation of larger, less structured webs. Marijuana resulted in smaller webs with more extended resting periods between web building. The chloral hydrate a sedative by the way, led to incomplete webs as the spiders fell asleep before finishing their work. I'm laughing again because I'm trying to imagine these results through a human perspective. You know what I mean? Do you see what I mean? Do you see the vision? Now, what was probably most surprising to the scientists was that caffeine had the most significant impact on the spider's web building ability. While a layman would consider caffeine a mild and common substance, its effects on the spiders were anything but. For the NASA experiment, caffeine led to the most disorganized and chaotic webs, indicating the impact it had on their behavior and motor skills. The results suggested that, despite prevalence in our daily lives, caffeine may have more potent effects on the nervous system than we often realize. I mean, yeah, if I'm being honest, my anxiety would probably be non existent if not for my caffeine intake. Although we understand that the parallels between the human nervous system and the arachnid nervous system is not well defined, we can't deny that the altered web building behavior for spiders under the influence of these substances provides a fascinating glimpse into the potential neurological effects of these drugs on humans. For example, amphetamines like benzodrine can lead to increased energy, focus, and impulsivity in humans, correlating with the large and less structured webs. Marijuana is known to have a more relaxing effect on humans, inducing a sense of calm and sometimes impairing short-term memory, which could explain the smaller webs and extended resting periods from the stoned spiders. Chlorohydrate, a sedative, by the way, can cause drowsiness and impaired coordination in humans, which may be why the spiders were unable to complete their webs. Honestly, very interesting to think about when you put it that way. Now, as for caffeine, it is known to cause increased alertness, restlessness, and sometimes anxiety in humans, which aligns with the chaotic and disorganized webs produced by the spiders. While caffeine does impact the human nervous system, the results of the NASA study should not be interpreted as evidence that caffeine had similarly detrimental effects on human motor skills and behavior. That's because the difference between the psychological and neurological makeup of spiders and humans means that the substance can affect each species in unique ways. Kind of stating the obvious there, but okay. You see, caffeine has a great impact on the human brain as a whole, but its greatest hit is on the adenosine receptors in the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is responsible for the higher level processes of the brain, such as language, memory, and emotions. Guess what? Spiders don't have a cerebral cortex, at least according to the National Institute of Health. As for the adenosine receptors, these guys are involved in many biological functions through the brain, including cardiac rhythm, blood circulation, and sleep regulation. When caffeine is involved, it binds with these receptors, which slows down these functions and can cause drowsiness. This reduces activity as the adenosine receptors, which may help promote wakefulness. Now, guess what? Spiders do have a type of adenosine receptor, whereas humans actually have multiple, 4 to be exact. The primary purpose of Dr. Peter and NASA's experiments was to explore the neurological effects of various substances on spiders' web-building behavior, to then hopefully be able to translate those results to the human brain and nervous system, so to get a better understanding of how these substances impact the central nervous systems. Spiders were chosen as the subjects for their unique ability to create intricate webs, which ultimately served as a visual representation of the results of their neurological state because they couldn't actually interview the spiders. Today, these experiments may sound a little silly to us, but back then it was actually pretty groundbreaking. Not only were we finding alternate ways to test on animals to hopefully translate to human effects, like we'd been doing with rats and monkeys, but we were discovering new ways to perceive certain substances, such as caffeine, that we had never thought to even consider. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for sticking around for another episode, and thank you again so much for all your patience and your overwhelming support. Please let me know what your thoughts on today's episode is down in the comments, because honestly, I'm still stuck on the fact that NASA never really told us the reasoning behind the drug spiders experiment, and I'm pretty sure they're hiding something from us. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised, but I'm just nosy. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and follow the podcast on Instagram for all episode news and updates at the Say Psychology Podcast. As always, citations will be linked in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.